Throughout the history of ancient nations, Mount Seir was a place of great changes and conflicts. Originally, this land was the home of the Horites, indigenous people who were also referred to as Canaanites or Hittites. This people was not foreign to the Israelites, as the mention of the Horites can be found in several parts of the Bible, including the 4th chapter of the book of Genesis. Seir was their home long before the Edomites appeared. The Edomites, who were descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother, after some historical events, found themselves in this land, quietly and gradually pushing out the Horites. This process of taking over the land was gradual but certain. Eventually, the Edomites fully took over the mountainous region of Seir and made it their home, while the Horites, though not disappearing, increasingly felt like foreigners in their own land. But what exactly made the Edomites successful in their takeover of the land? The main difference was in their system of governance. Unlike other peoples who typically had a monarchy passed down through inheritance, the Edomites were ruled by kings who were elected, not inherited. This system of choosing kings seemed unusual for the time, but for the Edomites, it was an effective way of creating stability and complete control over their land. This period of kings in Edom occurred before any kings reigned over Israel, even though God had promised Jacob that kings would come from his lineage. It seemed that Esau's blood reached royal status long before any of Jacob's did, while Jacob's descendants were still in bondage in Egypt. During this time of uncertainty, when the Israelites felt like slaves while the Edomites enjoyed their strength, the big question was raised: where is God's faithfulness? Why must God's people wait for their blessings? In the search for an answer, the truth about God's timing is revealed. God's plans are not always immediately visible. Sometimes it seems like those outside of the covenant enjoy their prosperity now, while those within the covenant must wait. This is a test of faith, because God's promises are sure, even when they seem delayed. God has not forgotten Israel, and their time will come. The Edomites may have had their time of glory, but it was brief. As time passed, the Edomites lost their kings and transitioned to a governance of dukes. This change in leadership is considered God's judgment on their cruelty and unfaithfulness toward Israel. They had refused to allow the Israelites to pass through their land when they were on their way to the promised land. In his justice, God weakened their power by dividing it among dukes rather than kings. This fall from monarchy to dukedom is significant and deeper than it seems. It is a message to all nations and to us today. When the power of force and wealth is abused, God allows it to weaken. The power the Edomites once had turned into something more modest, but that does not mean God's purposes were not at work. Even when it seems like God lets nations struggle among themselves, he is working behind the scenes, creating a true path for those who believe. Looking at all of this, the question of inheritance arises. On one hand, the Edomites had Seir as their possession, a land they owned and in which they enjoyed life. On the other hand, the Israelites were in Egypt, in bondage, without land to inherit. Yet, they had something much more special: God's promise of the land of Canaan. And while the Edomites enjoyed their present possession, the Israelites relied on the promise for the future. And when Seir seemed like something that would last, God's promise for Canaan was still waiting to be fulfilled at the right moment, in God's perfect timing. But what is more essential in this story? For many, the land of Seir may seem like something they have, something that appears so real and valuable. But as we learn from God's history, sometimes what we have in our hands is only a temporary illusion. Those who live by God's promises, though they wait, have something far greater and more important: eternity, which never decays. Seir was merely a temporary home for the Edomites, but Canaan was the land of promise for the people of Israel, a land that extends to all generations and will last forever. In the old days, when the world was simple and human hearts filled with great desires, there lived a man named Jacob. He was a man with many sons, but among them all, one was his favorite, the youngest, Joseph. His father loved Joseph more than all the others, And this love was expressed not only in words, but also through special attention. He made him a coat of many colors, a sign of his special place in the family. But this coat, with its bright and beautiful colors, also became a symbol of jealousy and envy among his brothers. Joseph wasn't just the favored one, he was also the bearer of God's gift. He had the gift of dreams. One night, he had a dream in which all his brothers bowed down to him, as well as his father and mother. In this dream, he became like a ruler, and his brothers gathered their sheaves of grain and bowed to him. But this was not something his brothers easily accepted. They had already felt discomfort because of his father's favor, and the dream only worsened the situation. As jealousy grew, they could not tolerate the humility they felt, as Joseph not only was loved by their father, but also seemed to impose a kind of superiority with his dreams. The day came when Jacob sent one of his sons, Joseph, to check on his brothers who were grazing the sheep on a distant hill. The brothers saw him approaching with his colorful coat, and their hearts filled with malice. This was the moment they decided to try out their plan. They had already been growing resentful of him because of their father's love, and now, with his dreams and his privileged status, it was the final straw. They threw Joseph into a dry pit, and in his heart, pain was planted that he would carry for the rest of his life. Joseph begged them to let him go, but they were merciless. As they sat around eating, a new idea appeared in their conversation. Judah, one of his brothers, suggested they not kill him, but rather sell him. The Ishmaelites who were traveling to Egypt were ideal buyers. For 20 silver coins, Joseph was sold to the traders and taken to Egypt, far away from his family and home. The brothers then set their next plan in motion. They killed a goat and soaked Joseph's coat in its blood, presenting it to Jacob as proof that his son had been torn apart by a wild animal. When Jacob saw the coat, his heart was pierced with pain. He fell to the ground, tearing his clothes, putting on sackcloth, and darkness of sorrow enveloped his soul. He called Joseph dead and rejected all comfort. His brothers tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He was determined to go to the grave with the pain of his lost son. Thus, Joseph, still young and full of hopes and dreams, found himself in the unfamiliar and dangerous land of Egypt. He was stripped of his family and everything that made him happy. Egypt, however, was full of unexpected opportunities and dangers. At the edge of Egyptian life, Joseph would have to face the harsh reality and start anew, but God was with him. In Egypt, Joseph was bought by Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's army. Potiphar was an important man in the Egyptian court, and Joseph, with his abilities and intelligence, soon rose to a high position in his household. But Joseph's life was not easy. One of the greatest temptations came when Potiphar's wife desired him and tried to make him sin. But Joseph refused, running from her advances, exposing her malicious intent. She, disappointed and enraged, accused Joseph of assault, which led him to prison. In prison, Joseph once again faced the harshness of life, but even here God did not forsake him. He found favor with the warden and became trustworthy and successful, quickly gaining influence even in prison. Eventually, God allowed him to interpret dreams, which led him to an important position before the heart of Egypt, before Pharaoh himself. This was just the beginning of God's plan for Joseph. Though his brothers thought they had destroyed